Okay, today we're going to be talking about saving our marriages to some extent. And the question is that and I have a lot of folks who reach out as a marriage and family therapist looking for advice and looking to know, okay, when do I keep going or when do I pull out? And I think this is a really hard conversation for a lot of folks, especially those of us who are in a relationship with Jesus. We don't want to disappoint the Lord. We don't want to cut off a partner and hurt our families, hurt our children. But things get really, really tough in marriages. And I've invited Becky Aste. She is going to be joining us. And Becky is a trauma informed marriage coach and the host of Your Breakthrough Blueprint, a top 10% globally ranked podcast. She is the CEO and creator of I Do Breakthrough, a company dedicated to equipping highly ambitious wives to repair thriving connection in their marriage by moving trauma out of the body. Really excited about this part. We'll get to that in a little bit. But after spending a decade researching and going through every mainstream modality of healing to save her own marriage, she found herself 2 kids later separated from her husband and on the verge of divorce. At the final hour, she stumbled upon the unconventional game changer of somatic work that took her marriage from dying to thriving in less than a year and it has made it her mission to get this into the hands of every woman possible ever since. Becky, welcome to the channel. I cannot wait to hear your story.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here, Kyle.
I'm very excited. And I actually joined you on your podcast first, which I'm humbled and thank you so much for having me on your podcast. Now I get to have you on my channel. I'm really excited.
Me too. And I've been listening to your podcast since the pandemic. So I never in a million years would have imagined this relationship, this
Mm,
connection. But yeah, I wasn't even doing what I was doing at that point. So this is wild and really special.
awesome. Well, I want to give you a moment to tell folks about your journey. You have a very unique and very special journey that you've been on. And I think as I was saying in the introduction, it now has become a platform in some senses for you to be able to minister to people. So let's talk about your journey and why you started your podcast.
Yeah, so I think the best place to dial back to would be it was my freshman year of college. I went to VCU, and the first week of college, my dad suddenly had a heart attack and passed away, and he
Oh
was only
wow.
57. It was like my first big T trauma really in my life. And that's when my grandma was like, you have a family down in Richmond. And I had never met them. It was like, second cousins and such. And they were a part of the ICOC. And so they're the only people that I knew in this like new state because I'm from Connecticut. And they really took me under their arms and brought me out to church. That's where I studied the Bible for myself, like was
Mm,
able to claim my own relationship with God, even though I grew up in a very religious home. This was where I made it my own and got baptized at VCU.
mm,
And that's where I met my now husband, Sebastian. I was a freshman, he was a sophomore, and he got baptized a month after me. We were the newbies in the ministry,
mm.
and at first had a really bad impression of each other. He thought I was, arrogant and my hair, it was like a New Year's Eve party and it was like Shirley Temple ringlet curls. It was not cute, but I thought it looked really cute. So not a great first impression. He wasn't dancing. I thought he was shy and just uninteresting, but we had soccer in common. So we started playing intramural soccer and seeing each other at ministry stuff. We just became best friends. That led to, dating all through college. And then we got married right after I graduated. And we were married in a mission team. All we had really known was campus ministry life and then right into a mission team. And then a year into marriage, got called out to Seattle to work on staff full time with the campus ministry. So, very much like the foundation of our relationship was ministry work. And It was an adventure, loved our time there, but we, had my son, who's now 7, Ollie,
Mm,
and Sebastian started to question, like, "Is this really a right fit for me? I don't think ministry is where I am the best version of myself," and it was just a new level of life for us, and it was a new level of stress, as beautiful it was having a new baby. We saw these, like, things, these behaviors, that on my end, you could call it codependency or, fear of abandonment really sifting to the surface and coming out. And then his own tendencies of addiction and escaping and isolating just starting to rise right to the surface. We stepped out of the ministry, moved back to the East Coast, and that toxic dance of, like, codependency and addiction just picked up speed, escalated for years,
mm,
here in our life in Virginia, and it was not getting better despite us trying a lot. Like, every stone I could unturnI tried. We did traditional therapy for years, couples counseling, EMDR, marriage retreats, workshops, any books somebody suggested for me to read,
mm,
I'm like, "I will read that." Literally every second I had free, like listening to a podcast, just I felt like I was on this decade long mission to hurry up and save my marriage so I could start enjoying life and
mm.
living again. And all it led to was 10 years later and 2 kids, we were separated, and talking very seriously and honestly about the possibility of divorce because both of us were like, we've tried everything and we're bringing out just the worst in each other. And so that's when, I was at home with the kids. I stumbled upon on Instagram this woman who teaches how to save your marriage by moving trauma out of the body. And it was
Mm,
the one thing I had never tried. This somatic work is kind of the term for it, learning how to regulate your nervous system and get into the body. Whereas everything I had tapped into for those 10 years prior were just from the neck up,
mm.
traditional talking, listening, learning. And it was the game changer. It ended up, and we can dive into it deeper as much as you have questions, but it ended up setting us on this path of healing and authentic communication and transformation. At first, just helped us survive it and then heal. But then we got to this place where it's like, we're thriving. What the heck is happening? We've never been here, even like in, you know, dating is one thing, but you don't really know each other then. Like, of course,
Mm.
it's fun and easy, but like, this is like we intimately know each other, like the good, the bad, the ugly. We've seen every piece, and now we're thriving. It was hard to believe. So I went on to do everything I needed just on my end to study, and learn and go through, trauma informed training, all the things so I could just get this into the hands of other women.
Becky, isn't it interesting what the glue is of our primary relationship? So, for example, one of the things I think about, especially when I'm doing couples counseling in practice, is helping people to be married to the marriage. I think sometimes what happens is we get married to the family, or we get married to the ministry. We get married to something else that becomes the thing that holds us together. And then after a while, something happens where we realize that that is an inappropriate or an unstable glue bond for us. And I love what you were talking about the codependence and so forth like that and how that filters in. But this idea of something else holding our marriage together, maybe it's a house, maybe it's a lifestyle, whatever it is, it sounds like you had an awakening where you realized, oh my goodness, even something is amazing. And I just want to say the ministry is amazing. It's a calling, it's a
Mhm.
blessing, it's an incredible opportunity to be in the ministry. And yet, I got to be honest, you're not the only person who's told me what you just told me. There's many people who are in the ministry who maybe in some ways were married to the ministry instead of married to the marriage. And so for you, because you can only speak for yourself, um, in what ways when you guys were in the ministry, was that kind of your thing? Was that kind of the thing that held you together in a sense?
Yeah, and nobody's ever asked me this before, and it really was easy to dupe myself and to think, like, maybe we aren't as bad as I think we are, because like,
Mm.
there's these behind the surface and gut feeling, feelings of like, this is off, this feels unhealthy, this feels toxic. But then we have people, after he preaches a great sermon, like, wow, your husband's so spiritual, so powerful. Or if we do something together, like, wow, you guys are a power couple, you're helping so many kids. So it's like, oh, I get very confusing. Like, I guess we're
Mm.
okay. And so I think it was just easy to rest on that and to not be able to like really strip away, yeah, that third party of our
Mhm.
marriage. I like how you put that, and to take a honest look at, of like what are we? Like what's connecting us, and then what's below the surface that may be roots we haven't tended to.
Yeah, before we go to the next question, I think just in humility and transparency in my own life, it it's kind of interesting how you talked about this persona that people grasp onto. In other words, oh, you are this amazing person who serves, or you can preach really, really well. And so it must mean this and this and this and this and this about you. And what's interesting is I've actually had to learn that just because I'm always sort of serving, or I'm always, speaking into people's lives, that that doesn't mean that I don't have issues at times in our
Mhm.
marriage and our family and so forth like that. And I remember maybe in the last year or something, I had to kind of start reconciling the fact that I'm a human being. I am a person who has a very complicated past and a lot of trauma, and just because there are times like in a social media situation that I'm out there and this persona looks a certain way, reality is something we have to stay connected to at all costs. We have to pursue
Mhm.
reality at all costs. And so anyway, as you were saying that, it just kind of made me think of my own life. But I want to ask you, I like this idea of being a trauma informed executive marriage coach. I think that's fabulous. I think I'm very, very interested in that. Um, I want to know how you approach the challenges of trauma, and specifically, how do you involve the body? You'd mentioned somatic processing. I
Mhm.
think that's a word we have to break down probably for our audience as well. But how do you approach trauma and involving the body?
Yeah, and somatic really just means pertaining to the body, especially in contrast to just the mind. So, even to give people, I'm just going to geek out for a quick second on
Yeah, yeah,
this
yeah.
one. But so, we all have what's called the vagus nerve, and it runs from the base of our skull to the bottom of our spine. And you can think of it like the superhighway of information, where these neurotransmitters, these chemical messengers, are constantly running up and down this vagus nerve from our brain to our body, body to our brain. Now, what we know now is only 20% of those internal messages go from our brain to our body, and 80% go from our body to our brain. So, in retrospect, it's like no freaking wonder I was spinning my wheels and felt like a salmon swimming upstream for so long, because I was really only tapping into the 20%. Whereas
Mm,
somatic work gets into that 80%, into the somatics, the body, the nervous system regulation. So that's kind of the idea of it. And as far as just even practically speaking, the journey that my clients go on, like once they walk through the door, I run a 6-month group coaching program for women. It's called Root to Rise, which
mm,
I don't know if you're familiar with that term, Kyle, but it's
mm-mm,
from yoga. So
mm,
yoga instructors will say root to rise, meaning like start with your feet on the ground, find your safety, find your footing, find your stability, and then you like rise up into the poses. So, the journey that the client goes on, we start with our safety programming, and then we literally go through all parts of our body. And we use the chakra system as a tool. And this
mm.
isn't like a new spiritual religion. It's really just a tool just to understand your body and the different, physical places in your body. There's different emotional programs that are connected to them. So we begin with shame, learning how to dissolve shame and really radical or embody radical self acceptance and self compassion. And the reason we start here is because it doesn't matter how awesome the tools are to follow. You're all going to go in one ear, out the other if you're stuck in this shame storm. So that's where we begin. And then we get into safety. So, safety in our own body, a lot of people who've been through trauma feel like their body has betrayed them, or they're at war with their
Mhm.
own body, or they have all these physical symptoms that they're just like, "My body is like, hates me. It's working against me." So we learn how to establish safety again in our own body and in our own environments. And then we move on to triggers. So, like, what exactly to
Mm.
do when we're triggered and how to navigate them with confidence so we're not just living life afraid of the next rug to be pulled out from underneath us.
Mm.
And then we get into ego and identity work. And so a lot of, or power and identity, I should say, just for understanding what I mean by powers. A lot of the women in the program, they've been through situations that have left them feeling powerless. So,
Mm.
common ones are abandonment, abuse, betrayal, neglect. And so we learn how to use our body to move back into a state of power. We get into body posture and what signals that sends about how we're viewing ourselves as well as how the outside world is perceiving us. And then we get into grief, like how to actually complete grief and move it out of the body. There's a way to do that. And then communication.
Mm.
As we're landing the plane, communications towards the end, even though that's the one thing that most women are like coming through the doors screaming, teach me how to
Mhm.
communicate with my
Absolutely.
husband. But I'm like, we got to do some internal work first. I promise we'll get there. And then the last two pieces are intuition, learning how to restore your own connection to your own intuition and to trust yourself, to learn what it feels like when presented with a choice. What is a heck yes? What is a maybe later? And what is a no that does not resonate with me? And the final thing is spiritual healing of my the journey they go on. A lot of the women have come in with maybe well-meaning but unhelpful, advice from spiritual mentors or communities. So being able to, delineate like what am I going to keep and what can I set aside? And then if there's any church hurt or church trauma, we end on that because I want women when they're out of my presence to be able to be set up with this toolkit that's going to set them on long lasting transformation. It's going to be them and their God always. So we end there.
I love that you start with the body. And if you're listening to this right now, for those of you that are listening, rather, um, whenever I teach anything on trauma, I always, 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 always start with the body. Trauma, and I shared this on your podcast, it's a body memory.
Mm,
When we get triggered, it throws us into the choreography of the past. So I love that you start with the body. I think my audience right now, for many of them, it's about starting with scripture. It's about starting with spirituality. It's about starting with these quips that maybe we've used for 35 years in discipling someone. Trauma's different. Trauma doesn't play by the rules that everything else is built around.
mm,
Trauma, you have to start with the body and the approach has to be right. Otherwise, you can get stuck for decades and not know why. And I think that the way you start with the body and then you build up, it makes a lot of sense. And guess what? What I really like about what you're saying, Becky, is that it builds resilience. Resilience is required to deal with your partner. Resilience is required to deal with if you have church hurts or trauma or whatever it is that's going on externally. I like that you're helping with the scaffolding internally.
mhm,
And I think for a lot of people, that's a shift in and of itself because it's like, no, 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 no. We need to start with what Jesus said about marriage, or we need to start with what he said about adultery. We need to start with sin. Well, I actually think sin is absolutely something that has to be addressed. You can't complete the healing cycle without addressing sin. However, even in the scriptures, Jesus doesn't always start with sin, does he? He starts somewhere else a lot of times, and ultimately he will address the sin, which partly is something that has to be forgiven and healed, but there are these other parts, these other steps that come before some of those things get addressed. And I love that you involve engaging, like people have to develop a relationship with their bodies.
mm.
They have to be safe on the inside, right? And so anyway, I love your approach. Let me ask you a couple of questions about your approach. Typically when women come in to see you, are they is their connection with their bodies very developed? Or would you say that normally it's underdeveloped?
Yeah, normally underdeveloped. So even like kind of the first couple of sessions, if they're sharing like, yeah, my husband didn't text me back and I got triggered and I was afraid he was out cheating or like whatever it is,
Mm.
I'll turn it back on their body and be like, what as you're talking about that, like what are you feeling in your body right now? And it's kind of funny to see like it's really common how many is a deer in headlights, which was where I started too. Like, what do you mean? That's just not usually the first question. And so some women are like, I have no idea. I'm like, that's okay. And then I'll guide them through kind of a body scan, like, hey, how's your breath right now? Does it feel open and relaxed,
Mm.
or does it feel kind of constricted? Like, how about your belly? Is it like open and kind of relaxed, or are you tensing it? So just helping them scan through their body and just learn, for the first time to start there.
So, in terms of helping people, because you start out with the body and then over time you evolve into identity, we have a tendency to translate experience into identity. So, what I've been through
Mm,
becomes who I am. That can be problematic, number one, because our identity isn't just based off of what we've been through, it's based off of who we belong to, number one. But number two, this idea of gut. I think a lot of people, when they've been betrayed, and there's different levels of betrayal, they lose the ability to trust their gut. Because they feel like either their gut didn't protect them or they didn't
yep.
listen to it. They didn't listen to
Hmm.
their gut. And that connection, that relationship with our body has to be restored. It has to be repaired. So let's talk first and foremost about how you think about identity. And then, secondly, how do you help teach people to work with their intuition?
I love these questions. So, yeah, with identity, it's really we get down to a deep subconscious level of what are we actually believing about ourselves? Like, what are
Mm,
the stories that we carry about ourselves? And what do we want others to believe about us or perceive from us? Not in a
mm,
people pleasing way, but more in like a legacy way. Like, when all is
mm,
said and done and my life has been lived, I'm at my final breath, what imprint have I left? How are my kids going to remember me? How are they going to talk about me? How are my friends going to say, Kyle was, Becky was? And so with identity, it is just getting to that and learning how even our body posture and the ways that we're holding ourselves have been protective through different things that we've survived. So for example, if we're very like rigid, that was me. I was super rigid, like rigor mortis. I didn't like to dance. I said, I'm not a dancer, but it was really because I was just like holding everything in so tight because it felt like my life
mm,
was out of control. And so I identified for a long time as just being uptight or rigid or perfectionist. And it's like, wait, is that really who I am? Or have I just been through a lot of chaotic stuff? And this
mm,
is my body's best way, of knowing how to protect me from more chaos. And so we flesh that out. And then with the intuition piece, you're exactly right. Like there's so many women who are living in marriages where there's either a secret sexual abasement or a secret, financial spending
mm,
habits or just secret life where you feel like something is off. And even if it's not like a big thing, like a big scandal, you can feel that your husband, for example, is just withholding things from you, doesn't feel safe to really be as open with you as you would like. And so something feels off in your gut, you bring it up, babe, you okay? Is everything all right? Yeah, yeah, everything's fine. No, I'm not worried about anything. Or we can get gaslit sometimes in
mhm,
situations where it's like, you're so dramatic. You're always making a big thing about this, or you're just insecure or overthinking it. And so, if especially if that's habitual, it does lead you to this place of like, well, I guess I'm just crazy. I thought something was off, but maybe I'm just like really in my head. And so we question ourselves a lot. And that was totally our story, where when he was in his addiction and just kind of escaping mode, which partly had to do with me not being a safe space for him to feel comfortable for opening up to me. We really fueled each other.
mm,
But there were situations where I'm like, something feels so off, and I would bring it up and he would, assure me like everything's fine. And then later I'd find out, the truth of what happened that weekend, or, what was really going on. And so it took a lot of repair. So sometimes the corroded relationship with our intuition comes from the marriage itself, or just maybe even growing up in a home where things like gaslighting were going on. And sometimes it's even well meaning spiritual communities and churches where it's
Mm,
like you're only taught to trust authority. And, I was in the church, like in the times where it's like you needed permission for everything. Like that was wise to get advice, which really meant just permission. And your heart is deceitful above all things. So, like, don't trust yourself ever is the message. I don't
mm,
think they were meaning to send, but is what I walked away with. And so we do learn that our body is designed by God, and he speaks to us in so many ways. And I've come to find like the body is a huge way that he speaks to us through that as well.
hmm. Oh, I love that. I love that idea of that there is repair that's needed on different levels. And I also love this idea of, secrecy, right? Secrecy, keeps the bad in. And I think in some ways we don't have a way to release shame. I think of in scripture when
Mm,
God says to confess, in some ways it's saying you need to agree with God, but there's this not confess so that you are shamed, it's confess so that you can be healed.
mm,
And I think that when we get stuck, sometimes we can develop kind of this secrecy thing where I've got to keep it in, I've got to work on it myself. I like what you said about safety. I think safety is important, and I think that you didn't just describe this as something that it's about one person just telling the truth.
mm,
Sometimes we look at it as, oh, okay, well, this person just lied to me, but there is a component of a person feeling safe enough and that they don't have to manage our reaction. So I really appreciate that because I think there's a lot of people that can identify that. You specialize in healing marriages. What are some factors that lead to emotional separation? I'm actually very curious about this one.
Emotional separation is a big one. There's attachment styles. I don't know if, the listeners are familiar. There's kind of four main attachment styles, nicknamed anxious attachment, avoidant, secure, and disorganized. And so the anxious attachment is more like me, the women like me, who a term might be thrown around codependent, or, needy, or fear of abandonment, like just very triggered by any kind of disconnection or distance or silence in the car or not responding to the text messages. And then avoidant is the opposite of like intimacy freaks me out and I don't want to get too close and I feel stifled and suffocated and give me space. And so that was where our dance came in of like chase and run.
Hmm.
Um Secure is the goal, right? Is and I believe everyone can learn how to become securely attached. Disorganized attachment's kind of a mixture of anxious and avoidant. It's like I'm afraid of disconnection, but then when it comes too close, I resist it. So how fun of a
Mm,
cocktail is that one? Um, but this is what was leading to these emotional blocks in our marriage in particular, and this is a really common one, so I'll just use this to kind of paint the picture. This deep abandonment wound that my body was carrying from my dad suddenly dying and disappearing from my life. This is what was always present in every interaction I was having with my husband and every
mm,
conversation, even if I was doing my best to present like, I got it and I'm secure and you do you, I'm not going to control you. There is this deep, like cellular level programming in there of I am so threatened by any hint of you piecing out or spacing yourself
mm,
from me. So it would lead to a lot of shame in certain situations. Like I remember our first month of marriage, the women in my church, we were going on like a women's getaway retreat. And I had like a panic attack that night, being separated from Sebastian. I was crying. I was like, what's wrong with me? Major shame storm. I'm like, I'm a grown human adult, like crying, like she would misses her mommy at a sleepover. Um,
mhm,
so it's these invisible, sometimes it's the elephant in the room that like married couples will say, I just feel like there's an elephant in the room. I can feel the tension. I can't really put words to it. It's this subconscious, wounds, traumas that a lot of us are carrying that we just haven't known how to properly release or complete or move out. So that's on my part, the anxious one. The avoidant or Sebastian, he had amazing parents, like well-intentioned, well-meaning, but there really was a disconnection emotionally in his household growing up. There wasn't he didn't feel seen, he didn't feel heard. There was, neglect, not because they're malintentioned, but just not knowing, any better how to really make him as a young boy in crucial times feel what connection is. So he was always very triggered. The emotional block on his end was like when we got too close or if I got too attached to him.
So I think this is a great place to ask the question that I couldn't remember a moment ago. I've remembered it. When I remember, kind of this culture for men in the church being, when it comes to, let's just say, purity, sexual,
Mhm.
whatever, acting out, the the culture for a long time was you don't tell your wife, you talk to the brothers.
Mm,
Um, and And I think that's interesting. I think it's changed through the years. I think that there is kind of this idea now that you still need to talk to the brothers. And if you really have an issue, maybe you need to get counseling, go to group or whatever. But you talked about, we're talking about emotional separation. That sort of culture of the guys talk to the guys and the girls talk to the girls about stuff happening in the marriage is something that in some ways, was wide sweeping. And so I'm just
mhm.
kind of wondering about that culture and now what you've learned in the culture of your marriage that you have now.
That's an amazing question, and I feel like I went to both extremes to feel out, like, there was some in the camp of, like, tell each other everything, every little, sexual acting out, and every time you look at pornography, Sebastian, tell your wife, and then there's others who were like, "Yeah, just keep it under wrap, like, just have him talk to the guy." So, I was so desperate, I was in that mode, right, of trying everything, so we swung to both extremes, and what I would say now is there isn't a blanket statement. Like there really is every single human is so uniquely designed with their own blueprint combined with traumas and gifts and good experiences and bad. And along with that, every single marriage is so unique and so different than anyone else with their own triggers, their own, what threshold of like what's comfortable and what's not. So I think this is where the intuition piece comes in, where I would just, that's when I get into the coaching of like, okay, let's explore. How does this feel in your body when he does open up to you about purity stuff?
Mm.
And bringing her like step by step into like what is going to help you feel the safest, what's going to help you protect, your own body and also feel connected to him. And so I wouldn't say it's like a blanket statement, one size fit all, but it can be unique just depending on the people and the marriage, what works best for them.
I like that you just said that because I do think people have individual capacities. Some people, um, there's one woman who wrote a book with her husband, or at least a chapter, and she talked about how a lot of women will go pain shopping. So this is where you become almost, you flog yourself with details. And I think that coaching could be really important for people who we need truth, right? That truth is what we build on. But I
Mhm.
think details can have a threshold of diminishing returns. I think that,
Mhm.
getting really specific about certain things. Now, if there's a huge sort of like, I've been holding this in for 10 years, then yeah, maybe we're going to have to really get really specific about a
Mhm.
lot of things.
Mhm.
But I like that you're saying that there's some room for nuance with this.
Mhm.
Um, Next question is, on your website, you mentioned the idea of how you can save your marriage without your husband being on board. Oh my goodness. This is probably going to be the tagline for our interview. And it's this idea of saving our marriage. Look, in and maybe this goes to the next question a little bit, but especially in churches, churches have promoted themselves as, we don't have a divorce rate here. We're the answer. In the world it's 50%, over 50%. But in churches, if you will, it's kind of this expectation that you're going to be married no matter what. What we're finding now is that some people are on their last leg. Some people
Mhm.
are on their last lifeline trying to save their marriage in churches, even. But even outside of churches, there's people trying to save their marriages. And the motto that I've always sort of heard is it takes two people to say yes and one person to say no when it comes to
Hmm.
marriage. But I'm really interested in how people can advocate for their marriage when it's kind of dying.
Yeah. So when I stumbled upon this program that I did for the somatic work, we were separated at the time and I invested it. I actually didn't even tell Sebastian about it until later. That was like the first financial investment I remember ever making without, talking to him first. But I was like,
Yeah.
well, we're separated and I just can't deny this feeling that I feel like I'm meant to do this. So when I did tell him, he's a skeptical person to begin with, like
Mm.
kind of predisposed to not be trusting of someone until, trust is proven. And so when he heard this stranger off the internet, I just invested in her program. He was very skeptical and like, wow, good luck with that. I was like, thanks. I can use all the luck I can get.
Mm.
Um, and so I was just like really quietly doing my own work through this program and, practicing all the tools that she was giving me. Uh, and Sebastian would come over for dinner still, like, although we were separated, I wanted him to see the kids, and it wasn't until it was 3 months into being separated, he actually came over and I was going out for a girls' night, and said, "I'm gonna be out late, if you wanna sleep over on the couch, feel free, you don't have to drive home late," and so he did that, and we woke up the next day and he had COVID. And this was when it was, like, the 15-day quarantine, and so we were
Oh.
like, "This is interesting. Okay, I guess we're gonna be together for 15 days." Didn't plan for this, but it was in that time that he was able to be around my energy for the first time in a while, and if you ask him now, like, where was the shift in this toxic dance starting to heal and kind of the tides turning, he would point to my energy basically, like, the vibe I was giving off was different. It was for the first time since him knowing me, he felt like, "Wow, Becky's really got herself. Like, she seems really anchored, she seems really grounded," and he was able to open up with me about some truths that I had never been a safe space in and of myself, let alone for him, in our marriage. And so it was in those 15 days where we were all had COVID together, where we had some of the most breakthrough, authentic conversations of our entire marriage. It was the first time I'd ever seen him cry,
Mm.
just like very honest back and forth. And so it was really that, like, it's learning when you learn to move trauma out of the body, it's kinda like you go from holding this sign up that says, "I cannot be trusted," no matter how much you're trying to convince them, you could trust me, open up to me," to, through this healing, it was like I was holding up this new sign, like, "I'm a safe space, you're welcome here, all of you." And so that's the shortest way I can answer it. That was really what, like, set us on this track of him just noticing a difference without me needing him. For me, for the first time in our entire relationship, getting to this place where it's like, "Look, I know if we don't work out, I'm actually going to be okay. It's still not
Mm.
what I want." Like, I was honest with him. I was like, "I would love for us to work out." But for the first time, I can honestly say and feel this in my body while I'm saying it, if we don't end up together, I'm going to be okay.
I There's so many things that you're sharing that I just think are they're inspirational to me. I as a marriage and family therapist, I can't tell you how many times people come in and the marriage is over. They
Mhm.
come in basically to go from couples to co-parenting, and that I can feel it when people come in.
Mhm.
And so what happens is oftentimes is I have to tell people, "Hey, we have to work harder on ourselves than we do the marriage for a while." And now that we become the focus in ourselves, and some people might say, "No, no, our communication needs work." No, 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 no. We need help with this. No, there is this individual relationship that we have with ourselves that the Lord helps us with that we have
Mhm.
to have. Two whole people make a whole
Mhm.
relationship, not two half. And so I love this idea of even you know, whenever I've told people and helped people through separations, there's something called a structured separation. In other words, separation can be like hospice if you're not careful. And so, a lot of people, if you're listening right now and you're going through a separation or you're about to, it is very important that you find someone to help you structure your separation, so that it can be purposeful and build up both people doing their own process. And so I think that the separation needs structure. You guys' separation was successful, which means it had structure and it was something that was built the right way. And I love that, by the way. But we do need some time. And I think, especially, this kind of goes to the next question a little bit. We do need some time, I think, sometimes to get some things figured out. Things get wonky. Think our interactions are just too hot. And John Gottman gets into this. You know,
Mm.
the he gets into the idea of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which is this idea of criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt.
Mhm.
And a lot of folks have contempt going on in their relationship, which is the most deadly of all of the factors. Contempt is where you start getting disgusted. It's where you start losing respect for your spouse. And again, this is stuff that happens in churches. But regardless, that's something that, like, we don't even know we're wreaking. We smell of these factors of criticism elicits defensiveness. Defensiveness elicits criticism. Stonewalling. I would say if a lot of folks have stonewalling in their relationship, which is having like a high guard up emotionally, it's only a matter of time before you're probably going to end up at least emotionally separated. Even if you're not physically separated, you can still end up emotionally separated for a long time, existing as
Mhm.
roommates. And I say all this to say the ultimate factor in that I always look for is contempt. Contempt is the number one predictor of divorce out of all of those. Let's talk about this just for one moment, because there's different things that can drive contempt up. Again, contempt is where we start losing respect. We start feeling disgusted. Without getting too personal and so forth like that with your situation,
Mhm.
if you want to share, you can share about it. But when you talk to different women, you're coaching different women, how often do you notice an air of disgust or contempt that's formed in their relationships?
Oh my god, have I ever met a woman that doesn't have that? Yeah, is the question.
Wow.
It's totally spot on, and, oh, it was me. I'm happy to share, like, the resentment, the anger, the hatred, honestly, and that was so hard for me to say because I know,
Mm,
like, God is for love and, hatred is bad, and so cue the shame storm on that too, but oh, I was seething, like, I couldn't even look at him without just felt like my eyes were red, like, blazing with
mm,
so much venom for a while, and, it's really, really common for women too to swing to the extremes of like,
hmm.
"I wanna kill him," and then like, "I love him, I miss him," and then feel crazy for that too, but it's such a natural part of the trauma healing process, like, even when you learn about, even animals, when you study how animals, when they're faced with, like, life-threatening situations, or their own trauma, there's this period of kind of paralysis, and then when they come to again, there's this, like, very big energy, burst of rage and anger. So, it's a really natural part of the process, but it can feel so tricky for Christians who are
Mm,
like, anger's the worst."
right. Yeah. The last question I want to spend a little bit of time on is, what advice do you have for those in churches who find themselves kind of at their last, I mean, they're on their last leg, so to speak?
Hmm. Man, I mean, first of all, I think I'd just say that the shame is real, the shame
Mm,
storm. I feel like divorce is the scarlet letter of our church. It's kind of the leprosy of our modern day spiritual communities. And so finding safe spaces who are not going to judge you, offer unsolicited advice, tell you what to do before just holding space and listening is a massive piece of just dissolving the shame. And the shame too of like, what's wrong with me? We're looking around, seeing other happy couples, right, at church, and that can lead to the anger and the despair and the envy of like, that's the life I wanted and I don't have that. And
mm,
so I wanna empathize, for the people who are in that position, and then second, I'd say it's impossible to have clarity on whether you should stay or go when you're in a dysregulated state, when your nervous
Mm,
system is in dysregulation. A really common trauma response is indecisiveness. A lot of the women that I work with are like, "Should I stay? Should I go?" They cannot make a decision to save their life, and that was me for, a decade. And I was like, what's wrong with me? Like, am I weak for staying? I had friends who were like, you could do better, move on, Those were not friends in the church, but still I was like
mm,
getting advice like that, and it was just making it more confusing. And it wasn't until I learned to heal my nervous system and move that trauma out, complete this grief,
mm,
that I'm like, oh, hello, intuition. That's what you sound like. It's like that scripture where God came in a quiet whisper. It wasn't,
mm,
the loud noises or the wind. It was this very subtle, peaceful knowing of, okay, these are my next steps. And the other thing I would say is, yeah, just the importance of healing any spiritual wounds, or like taking a look at the advice that really well-meaning, incredible people in the church have offered just because they care, just because they want to help, but may not be trauma informed. And so
mhm.
I would just encourage those listening to seek somebody who is trauma informed. I think it's a growing it's growing in our society, Kyle, like your podcast. That's why I've always been drawn to it, because I think the church could avoid so much hurt too with just a little bit of trauma informed training. I wish I had it when I was in the ministry. I had to
Mm,
go back and apologize to so many people because I'm like, holy cow, that was so not trauma informed. Um, but I would say, yeah, just like don't be afraid to take a curious, honest look of like, what are those, pieces of advice that have been instilled in me over the years that I haven't even questioned? Like, this is how you save a marriage. Some examples are, that scripture in Ephesians 4, where it's like, be angry and do not sin, do not let the sun go down on your anger. I remember getting advice where it's like, never go to bed angry, right? And so for years, we'd stay up till like 3 a.m. fighting the most like
oh,
uncomfortable, like unresolvable conflicts. I think you can
yes.
relate. Yeah, the sigh. Um, or the one we talked about earlier, the Jeremiah scripture, the heart is deceitful above all things. So there's this like deep fear for a lot of women, to who take that to an extreme or just don't understand that really that's God saying that word deceitful. When you look deeper into it, it's more like deep waters, like it's complex, it's mysterious. It's not so much deceitful in the sense of like you're a bad person and you cannot trust yourself or your emotions. And so not being afraid
Mm.
to like question and dive deeper into like, what did God really mean about these things? As opposed to maybe what a well-intentioned culture just kind of swept up its meaning to be. And so,
So one of the things that I want to kind of lean into a little bit more is this idea that we know we it takes two. However, you really are helping women to do their part to try to save their marriage, even if their partner isn't on board.
mhm,
The expectation is that if someone's in a church, then they're going to want to save the marriage. Well, first of all, churches are predominantly made up of women, number one, but there's a lot of churches made up of women whose husbands don't come, number two. But more importantly, I think women are, and I don't want to be sexist in saying this, but women, I think, are more relational.
mhm,
And that is more nurtured, I think, for women. Men, I think, have but I think it's just more, I think women are endowed with a certain um, acumen when it comes to being relational. That being said, I think this creates a little bit of a dilemma because even if you're doing your part, as you do your healing, your standards come up,
mm,
especially if you're codependent.
mhm,
So what I'm willing to take in terms of toxicity changes.
mhm,
When I don't believe that's what I'm worth anymore, or this marriage is not holding my identity together, that what I'll take in terms of being a punching bag verbally or even horribly, I'd hate to say even physically,
yep,
changes. What I'm willing to do to save my marriage changes. and people can't use certain scriptures or techniques against me to get me to stay in a marriage where I'm undergoing a certain level of deterioration.
Mhm.
And so I want to just let's talk about that for a moment because sometimes marriages die. Sometimes as a marriage and family therapist, I've had to help people have a good goodbye,
Mhm.
and be better co-parents than they were as a couple. So there is a mortality rate when it comes
Mhm.
to marriage. But as you're helping people as they grow, we want them to stay in the marriage. Sometimes that gets a little tricky though, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it's exactly what you said. Like when you do heal on this deep level, like you're rising, your standards are rising, your self-worth and everything. So I remember the moments where it was like for the first time in our whole marriage, I was like, "You're gaslighting me. I'm not okay with that." And I was like,
Yep.
"There's this psychological abuse." And so it was me swinging to the other extreme. Then I found kind of the middle ground of like, well, that's not helpful either.
Yeah.
But it was like for the first time, I kind of had a fight for myself instead of just defaulting to this low self worth. And so, what you see, yeah, in marriages is I see it a lot with the woman taking the lead. It's just kind of, yeah,
Mm.
matter of fact, the woman seems more interested in healing, is kind of leading the way in that. And then that's either going to call out the best out of her husband, and he rises with her, or it's going to make it really clear that like he's not there and he's not willing to heal, he's not willing to reconnect. But either way, it's this point, this really tender point in a client's life where she is in survival mode and she's suffering. And like you said, in some situations where it is abuse, where her safety is actually at question, and she has this decision of like, okay, either way, like I need to get out of this for my own life, for my children's life. And best case scenario, for a lot of women, it's that like he changes and turns the stance along with me. But even if not, that she's able to get to this place of even if, like, I'm going to be okay.
Mm.
And so, man, Kyle, like, I remember just going through, especially with the theology of it, and, like, I don't wanna displease God, and studying out what are the grounds for divorce, like, diving into all of that. And it is just a case by case decision for each person to decide between them, their God, their conscience, and their marriage. What is the best next steps? And it doesn't have to be rushed. There can be, a curiosity phase, unless, like you said, in situations where it is, physical abuse or there is unsafety, obviously getting help in those situations to move yourself to safety, whether that's, a separation for a time or whatever that looks like with some guidance of a professional.
I just love the overall approach that you're taking. And a couple of things. Number one, I don't believe that everybody needs to see a clinician per se in order to receive healing. I think that because of the way that information's working, people are becoming equipped. You don't
Mhm.
have to see a licensed independent mental health practitioner necessarily. You don't have to see a certified marriage and family therapist and all these things to actually get some really amazing guidance. And I just am grateful for the work that you're doing, because I want to start to feature people who very much are equipped as coaches. And there's a lot of things that I think in some cases will provide an additional benefit for folks. And the other thing I really appreciate about your overall approach is I trust it because you work with the body. What I'm really hearing you say in this entire conversation is that as we partner with the body, again, our bodies are, kind of this shared real estate between us and our experiences. As we partner with our body, as it holds the story, will help us to navigate the story. We just need some help. I think of relationship as a contact sport.
Mm.
And so for you, you're helping people to partner with their bodies so that they can get in tune and aligned internally. And as they get aligned, they can figure out what in the world they value. Why did they even get in this thing in the first place? What's their why for wanting to continue on? Is it fear? We see that the Bible says that perfect love drives out fear. So if fear is the thing keeping you in your marriage, that's actually an inappropriate fuel source because fear is not enough to keep us in a relationship with God forever either. And so
Mhm.
I think it's a great I think what you're going to do is you're going to help people be unburdened so that if they stay in the marriage, they can stay in it for the right reasons and not give their kids this horrible impression cuz the other thing is kids are watching. Like
Yep.
we are showing them how to be married through our marriages. And so this has immense downstream consequences if we're honest with ourselves, Becky. I think the work that you're doing is very meaningful and very needed. And I'm grateful that you joined me today.
Thank you, Kyle. Everything reflected right back to you. Ditto. I love what you're doing and how many people you're helping. So this was an honor to be here and just chat with you.
Well, we are with you and God is for you, Becky. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kyle.